Thank you. And normally I wouldn't use this, but they say it's going to help with the recording, so I'll try to do both. But as I've been mentioning, the biggest challenge when I was asked to give this presentation was narrowing down the information, because I have weeks and weeks and weeks worth of presentations I could give on the textile history of Gaston County, because it is such a rich and unique history. And maybe not so unique, because it was true in every small town in the South, that had a textile mill. A lot of the exact same stories we hear over and over again. But Gaston County was unique for several reasons, in that for several decades we were the center of comb, cotton, yarn production anywhere in the country, and some say the world. No way to prove that really, but they say that we produced more. We definitely knew we had more textile mills than any other county in North Carolina, and North Carolina had more textile mills than any other state in the country. And by the mid-1920s, we surpassed Massachusetts, which was the leader in textile production for many, many years, in the number of spindles. And that's how they judged who was the largest producer of textiles, the number of those individual yarn spindles. And we had more spindles than Massachusetts did. And the big secret was this little thing called industrial humidification. And we now call it air conditioning. Early on, before air conditioning, our mills were subject to heat and humidity, and we could not produce the fine yarns that they could up in the north. And so we could not produce the full range of yarns that people wanted. But by the time that Carrier created industrial humidification, and Stuart Kramer, called it air conditioning, then all of a sudden Stuart Kramer adapted that industrial humidification for the textile industry and started putting it into textile plants. And that's why, if you ever drive by most mills, you'll see that their windows are bricked up. And that's not because they're boarded up for safety or security. It's because they air condition those mills. They put air conditioning in the mills so they could run lots of different fibers and fabrics. And Lorraine is one of the few exceptions. Lorraine, if you've ever been by there in Gaston and see the Lorraine mill, it was far too large to ever air condition. So that was a problem. So it was never air conditioned. But the Lorraine was also far too large to tear down. And that's what helped save the Lorraine mill. It was going to be way too expensive to tear it down. But anyway, I'm getting off on tangents, but let's get started. I am going to move quickly. In fact, I'm going to break two rules from my public speaking class right from the beginning. Number one, I put way too much text in my PowerPoint presentations. You'll see that as we go through there, way too much text. And then the second thing, the rule that I've broken, is I apologized before I ever started my presentation for something that I'm about to do. You're never supposed to do that. Never apologize before you ever speak. Because now I've set the bar really low. So let's find out what we know. I am a museum guide. I'm a textile researcher, a textile historian. They call me at the Gaston County Museum of Art and History. 2026 is a special year for several reasons. Number one, it's the 50th anniversary for the Gaston County Museum of Art and History. We started on July the 4th, 1976, so this is our 50th anniversary this year. It's, as you know, the 250th birthday of our country. It is the 180th birthday of Gaston County, and a little more locally, it's the 150th anniversary of the year that the Mount Holly Cotton Mill started up production. It started in 1876, so it's 150 years ago that the Mount Holly Cotton Mill started. So, with all that being said, we're going to cover as much of the early years of textile history as possible. Can't go into a lot of depth, like I said, but we're going to go through. We are going to go into depth in the textile mills, and the textile mills in Mount Holly is really what we're going to focus on. So you're going to get a lot of detailed information about those mills, and then some superficial information about all the other mills. And the time period that I'm covering is 1848 really to 1922. Why 1922? That was when the last mill was built in Gaston County that had an associated mill village with it. After 1922, no more mills and mill villages were built in Gaston County. So we consider that kind of the golden age of textile mills and textile mill villages. What happened is they started reusing those older mills, for new startups and building just manufacturing facilities or plants, but no mill village went along with it. So that's the time period that I'm going to try to cover, but I will go a little further, all the way up to 2026 with Mount Holly and with the background of textiles there. So let's see what we have. Why Gaston County, first of all? Why did people choose Gaston County to begin with? Well, let's go back a little ways, 300 million years. I'm going to go year by year, all the way up to the present. We're going to jump forward quite a bit, but no, 300 million years ago, what we consider America was covered by dense, swampy forest, which created a lot of decay and a lot of rich, nutrient-rich layers of materials. Then, fast forward 75 million years ago, the Earth warmed, the ice caps melted. The Earth goes through natural cycles of warming and cooling, and the ice caps melted, and so half of the country was underwater. In fact, Mount Holly would have been prime beachfront property because we were right on the border. Gaston County was right on the border of that sea back 75 million years ago. But then we jumped forward to 50 million years ago, and what happened is the Earth cooled again. A lot of that water got trapped in ice. Those seas receded. The Earth, was pushed up, and what it revealed was millions of years of what we call the Selma chalk layer. That Selma chalk layer was where those years and years of sand and exoskeletons and fish bones and everything that was in that ocean sunk to the bottom and created a real nutrient-rich layer that then started blending with all the vegetation that was falling and decaying on top of that. And you may ask, well, what does all this have to do with textiles? It has a lot to do with why the United States, the southeastern part of the United States, was a very desirable place to be. In fact, the indigenous folks knew about it 10 to 12,000 years ago. They came here. Most, I guess, commonly it was the Catawba Nation and the Eastern Band of Cherokee, but also there was the Waxhaw and the Chirraw and several nations that would come and trade and move through this area. So this was a very vibrant area, but they also had rich soil. They knew it was a great place to grow things. And we also had something else we'll talk about in just a second. And then we jump forward to why European settlers came to this area. And it's because of the Great Wagon Road. We had this, makeshift highway from the north to the south. The cities were getting crowded in the north. People were looking for land. More people were immigrating to the New World and to the United States, and they were looking for places to expand and move to and farm. And so they started following. And you see one track, the main track leads into the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. But then around Roanoke, they're split off another section that became known as the Carolina Wagon Road, because it led to North and South Carolina. And it came very close to Gaston County. So a lot of people would come down as far as Charlottetown or Charlottesburg, they said it was called, and then they would branch off and go into the different areas. And of course, then we had not only the Pennsylvania Dutch, which is just a misnomer for Deutsch, the Germans from up north coming down, but we had the Scots-Irish coming up the riverways from Charleston and from Wilmington. And we had a few real Dutch, like James Kirkendall, who was one of the early folks in this area. And we had a few English, but primarily it was German and Scots-Irish. In fact, the two major players in the industry in Mount Holly One, A.P. Ryan, Abel Peterson Ryan, was of German descent. And then Charles Egbert Hutchinson, he was Scots-Irish. So representing both of those ancestral groups that came over. But why here? We had land. We had lots of land, kind of for the taking, for homes, gardens, pastures. We had a great climate, a long growing season compared to the northern areas. People came down to farm, and look at that. We had good soil down here from years and years of natural erosion. We had timber as far as the eye could see to build those houses and barns and eventually textile mills. We had a food supply, lots of game, lots of, in fact, up until the 1700s, we had bison in this area even. A lot of people don't realize that. They were all either killed or run west of here. We had plants and herbs for both food and medicine, so that was we were rich in those areas. And then perceived safety after the 1830s, because Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. So any Native American populations that were still here, they were either relegated to the reservations, or in 1838, we know of the Trail of Tears, where mainly the Cherokee were forced to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so that kind of cleared out this area and made it perceived as a safe area, because the natives were considered savages, and you know, if you run across them, they're going to kill you and take your property and all those kind of things, which was not true in a lot of cases. But more importantly, we had water. This county was rich in water, and that's also the main reason why the textile industry came here in 1848, was our water. We had, of course, the two main rivers, the Catawba River and the South Fork of the Catawba River. Those were two valuable waterways. But what a lot of people forget are all the other branches and creeks and tributaries we have in Gaston County. The ones that are bolded are the ones right here in the Mount Holly area. But any one of those branches and creeks could be dammed up, and they could produce a flour mill or a sawmill, or they could use it for the power of that water. So once again, we had lots of water, lots of good land, lots of reasons to come to this area. Now, what I mentioned earlier, what used to be underwater, that nutrient-rich chalk, Selma chalk layer, merged with all those decaying vegetation, created a very fertile area from southeastern Virginia all the way to Texas. And it was referred to as the Black Belt. Later on, that became known for a more nefarious reason, and that's because this is where the majority of the enslaved Africans were also found too, in this same belt, because that many of them worked on the plantations and the farms in the South. So that was both a good and a bad thing. But you see the little star there is where we are, and look how we're uniquely positioned halfway between the industrialized north and the agrarian south. So once again, that made us a prime spot to be in. And we knew we could grow almost anything. Two of the most important cash crops at the time were, of course, tobacco and cotton. Farther east, it was more the pine trees and the naval stores, the tar and pitch and things like that. But here, we were growing tobacco and cotton. So that brought the textile industry here. This is just a real quick look at 1850 to 1930, the growth of the textile mills in Gaston County. This indicates the new textile mills that popped up in Gaston County. You can see it was a distinct curve upward or trend upward. And then we're going to take a look at each of those mills as we go. It all started with Randolph Tate, or Thomas Randolph Tate. He was not from Gaston County, he was from Greensboro. He and his father-in-law, Henry Humphreys, had a mill in Greensboro. The reason why he came here was, number one, there was land available, but there was a problem in Greensboro. That mill was being run by steam. In order to create steam, you had to keep a fire going. And to keep a fire going, you had to have fuel for that fire. Wood, coal was not a readily available commodity at that time. So wood or some type of burning material, that was getting scarce and harder to find. So he said, well, why don't we use the natural resource of water to power our mills? And he had been here before, from one recollection that I read, he had been through this area before, so he saw the Catawba River and the South Fork River, and I think that's why he chose to come and build his mill here. So here you're going to see information overload coming up, starting with this mill, because even though this was not Mount Holly at the time, I consider it to be part of this area. There was actually a community called Mountain Island, a mill village and a whole community called Mountain Island, but it never formed into a city because it all got washed away in the flood of 1916. But let's talk about it. Really starts back to right after the American Revolution. 1796, there was a group called the North Carolina Catawba Company that was created, and they were commissioned by the federal government to make our rivers more navigable so we could take and get goods from the inner parts of the country down to the coast. And of course on the Catawba would lead down to Charleston. And so late 1790s, early 1800s, the company digs a canal around the rocky shoals at a sharp bend in the Catawba River, which of course when they did that, it was to allow ships to come through there. But by the time this company was taking so long to dig these canals and make the river navigable that steam engines came around and trains came around and kind of made this group obsolete. So a lot of these canals were left unfinished and unused because steam engines were better. And so for that reason, there was a natural race, what we call a mill race, to funnel water to a water wheel dug by this canal. So Tate and his associates in the 1840s bought 900 acres of land from Michael Quickle, David Caldwell, John Farrar, and several others. And in 1848, he and his father-in-law actually built the first mill. And it was actually a pretty impressive mill to be the first mill. It was a brick mill, 4 stories tall, which is larger than most of the other mills that came right after it. In fact, it was expanded a little later, which we'll see. 1871, Thomas Tate died and his sons took over. They built another mill right beside it. So it actually had 2 4-story mills. In fact, the 4th story in the new edition, they eventually added a 5th story to that. So it was a pretty impressive mill for the time. Later on, William J. Hooper of Baltimore purchased the mill, and Hooper Manufacturing was established. They reorganized it as the Mountain Island Manufacturing Company. They added electric lights in 1886. Wasn't the first. The first of this area would have been McCadden Mills. They put the first lights in 1881, electric light system. Then in 1897, it was leased to the Linen Thread Company and operated under the name W.J. Knox Net and Twine Company. And then the management, they didn't do well, so the management reverted back to the Hooper family. And then, this is an important fact, it was purchased by the Southern Power Company. Back as early as the turn of the century, the Southern Power Company started to see with wide eyes the potential of all this water power. So they started trying to buy up everything they could along the rivers. Everything they could, land, buildings, mills, whatever they could. They either invested in them, if they couldn't buy them outright, they invested in them with the hopes of buying them later. They didn't care about the textiles they were producing, they cared about the water power. That's what they cared about, because that's how they were going to produce it. In fact, most people don't realize it, but early on, the electricity that was created was not from the city and then going out to the mill villages. It was actually being created by the mills and going out to the city. It was going the other way. This is where we first see Charles Egbert Hutchinson come to play. He forms what's called Army Manufacturing Company. In 1910, he leases the mill from Southern Power Company, and a short 6 years later, it's all gone. Because the Great Flood comes along and swept away not only the mill, but the mill village, and nobody could afford to rebuild at that time. Southern Power Company was perfectly fine with that because they still owned all that land. They said, okay, if you're not going to build a textile mill here, then we're going to use it for something. So construction began on the hydroelectric station and a dam. In fact, most people don't realize it, but until 1848, Mountain Island Lake was not a lake. There was no lake there. It was just the Catawba River. There happened to be a place called Mountain Island. But until that first dam was built for the Tate Mill, that's what created Mountain Island Lake. And then when Southern Power built their larger dam, that made Mountain Island Lake even larger. And then we had the Catawba Manufacturing and Electric Power Company. They completed the plant and they created the lake. And it was the first river to actually be used as a planned source of power anywhere in the United States. The Catawba River was the first one. They had plans for a series of dams and hydroelectric plants all up and down the Catawba River to produce electric power. 1924, Southern Power becomes Duke Power. We recognize that name. Duke merges with Pan Energy and becomes Duke Energy in 1997. And then in 2026, more than 7,600 homes are powered by that station, and more than 1 million people benefit from that area. So there's the Mountain Island Bell. Percy Roberts found it, half buried in the river. You know, I guess I don't know how long it was after the flood, but found it and of course kept it for many years, but then finally donated it, and it's down in the museum, so you can see it today. In fact, that's it, the one that's down in the museum right now. This is what the hydroelectric station looked like about 1924, and I'm not sure these houses here. Every report I've ever seen says that the flood of 1916 wiped away the entire mill village. So I assume these were houses that were built by Duke Power, not left over from the Mountain Island mill, because the entire mill village and the whole town of Mountain Island disappeared off the map at that time. It never again formed. And then of course that's what it looks like today, 103 years later. Okay, so that's the first mill. Second mill was Caleb John Lineberger's. It was called the Woodlawn Mill. However, it was not on the Catawba River. It was way over on the South Fork River. So that shows you the influence of this little settlement called Woodlawn, that he named it after this settlement way over here, even though he was over on the South Fork River. And of course, his sons would go on to be big textile folks, primarily in Belmont. This one is the third mill, and actually this is not a picture, I have to be honest, this is not a picture of the actual mill, but based on the description, this is what it would have looked like. We have no known pictures of the Stowesville or the Stowe's factory mill that was built by Jasper Stowe. Jasper's dad, by the way, was Larkin Stowe, who was one of the legislators that helped form Gaston County out of Lincoln County back in 1846. He was one of the legislators. So Jasper Stowe had a mill. All three of these mills were wealthy in Confederate dollars. So when the Civil War happened, all that wealth disappeared. In fact, many mills in the South, many businesses and structures in the South were burned by the Union Army. They were destroyed by the Union Army. Some reason, all three of our mills survived. And there are stories and theories as to why that was. Some say that the Tate Mill was actually producing material and shipping it north to the Union side. We don't know how true that was, but there are stories of that. But anyway, there was no mills, of course, being built during the Civil War. In fact, it was a while. It was almost 10 years after the Civil War was over, during Reconstruction, that our next three mills came to be. And the Mount Holly Cotton Mill. And if you see, from now on, if you see the name in red, that means that the mill still exists. If you see the name in red, that means that the building still exists. It may not be a textile mill, and it may not be used for the same purposes, but it still exists. Then we had the Wilson and Moore Mill, which became known as the Spencer Mountain Mill. In fact, there's debate among historians as to which of these two was really first, because they were chartered the same year and they started building them the same year. And actually, the Mount Holly cotton mill didn't start production until '76. And so some people think that the Spencer Mountain Mill may really be the fourth mill, but I haven't found anything to confirm that, so we're still going to say that Mount Holly cotton mill was the fourth and Spencer was the fifth. And then also around that same time, sorry for the feedback, was the Lawrence Mill, a mill that Robert Reagan in his books, he doesn't even qualify that as a mill. He doesn't even count that as one of the mills because it was only short-lived. It was only about a 10-year life. But it was a nice brick mill built about 100 or 200 yards south of the Woodlawn Mill. But it burned, early on, and it was never rebuilt again. They say they repurposed the bricks from that mill, and they repurposed the wood from the Woodlawn Mill and built houses in Lowell and McAdenville with those. So there could be parts of those mills in the houses in McAdenville. But by 1900, the Lawrence Mill was gone. So let's look at 1870s, and let's look at the Mount Holly Cotton Mill, which was originally listed in all the books as the A.P. Ryan and Company. It was not listed as the Mount Holly Cotton Mill. And so it was the first mill built following the Civil War. It's the first mill built in the Woodlawn, which eventually became Mount Holly. First mill built on Dutchman's Creek, and the fourth mill, we think, in Gaston County. And of course, there's Abel and his younger brother Daniel Ryan, which is better known for doing things in Lincoln County than he is here. And he's also the namesake of Lenore Ryan. So he contributed enough money to take that college from Lenore to Lenore Ryan. So the Ryan and Lenore Ryan is Daniel Ryan, Uncle Dan. That's what everybody calls him. So very quickly, we'll run through these. 1850s, so the first land grants were issued in this area. The post office near Dutchman's Creek was listed as Woodlawn or Woodlawn. The railroad came through around 1860, the Wilmington-Charlotte Rutherford Railroad, which eventually became the Carolina Central Railroad. The Ryan brothers had a general store here that their dad, Moses Ryan, had started, and they were running. Then they purchased about 40 acres along Dutchman's Creek. They constructed a mill that was 3 stories, brick with a stone foundation and a steep roof, and all the bricks were said to have been made right there on site from the mud out of the river. Production began on April the 1st, 1876, with carding on the first floor, twisting on the second floor, and spinning on the third floor. The product was a coarse carded yarn. Original associates were the Ryan brothers, Ambrose Coster, who was Abel's father-in-law, and J. Abernathy, who was the brother-in-law of the Ryans. And you'll see that Abel Ryan liked to work with family. Even though he had other associates, he would often get rid of those associates and bring his family in. He enjoyed working with his sons better than I think he enjoyed working with anybody else. And you'll see that throughout his history. The mill was referred to as the A.P. Ryan. It was water-powered. 1,200 spindles to start with, 25 employees. The letterhead read, Mount Holly Mill, Tuckasegee Railroad Station, Woodlawn Post Office. So that's how it was identified early on. Then Mount Holly was finally incorporated in 1879. So then it was the Mount Holly Cotton Mill. The mill had expanded, and A.P. Ryan did not use an agent up north like a lot of the southern mills did to sell yarn. He would actually load up wagons full of yarn. He would go out a couple days ahead and sell it to businesses and individuals, and then the yarn wagon would come later and fulfill those orders. And he did that all throughout the mountains of North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Then he realized with his next mill, he could use his time a lot better than that, so he actually got an agent after that. And he was doing it on his own to start with and not selling to the north. He was selling all of his yarn south. An extra 12-hour shift was added because the demand was growing so high for the yarn. The mill started with a debt of $4,000, but by 1884, he ended up with a profit or surplus of $42,000, so he was doing really well. His brother Daniel Ryan sells his stake, his interest in the mill, and goes on to do other things in Lincoln County. Then that's when Ryan's son, Henry, joins the company. It was reincorporated as Mount Holly Cotton Mills Company, with once again, Ryan, his son, and his son-in-law, E.R. Cannon. So if you're familiar with the Cannon Lentz house in Mount Holly, that was his son-in-law's house that Abel Ryan built for him. The mill had 2,800 spindles. The pay was 75 cents to $1.25 per day. That was for a 12-hour day. And then boys and girls were allowed to work there too. Boys got 25 cents and girls got 10 cents for the day. So it's been going on forever. Yeah. 1916, the mill received $20,000, which is $612,000 in 2026 money. And damages from the flood. He repaired and went into operation, but I think that may have done it in for A.P. Ryan, because by 1918, he started selling all of his textile interest and retired essentially by 1918. That's why in 1919, Egbert Hutchinson bought the mill. He purchased the mill and organized it as the Alsace, and the Alsace was probably an homage to Ryan, because that's where his descendants in Germany were from, the Alsace-Lorraine Valley. So that's probably why he named it that, in honor. And then you have Isaac Christopher Lowe and A.L. Smith. The team expanded the mill with another 3-story addition. So that's the thing that you see when you first go down. That first 3-story addition is the newer mill. What's down below is the original mill. Production was increased to 5,600 spindles. Alsace was merged into the newly formed American Yarn and Processing Company, which was what Hutchison created to consolidate all of his mills. Management ceased operation during the Great Depression, and essentially in 1932, it was never, after 32, it was never used for textile yarn production again. And that may be what saved it. It's because it was not used. It was used for storage all those years and not worn out like a lot of the mills were that were eventually torn down. It was used just for storage, warehousing. Then American Eford was created. They turned it into an experimental research facility so they could try out new things on a small scale in that facility. They discontinued the use and put it back as a storage. Then we have Robert Friedel, who purchased it in 1973. And fortunately, he was not only a good textile man, but he also was a lover of history. And so he kept the historical integrity of the mill intact over the 42 years. He put it on the National Register of Historic Places in '96. And then, of course, we know that the Delaney's bought it in 2022, and it opened in 2024 as Muddy River Distillery. And so that's what it looks like today. Then we had a period where the Spring Shoals manufacturing, the Tuckasegee manufacturing mills, and McCadden Mill number 2 was built. And so let's take a look at Tuckasegee. A.P. Ryan started the first 3 mills in Mount Holly. The Mount Holly Cotton Mill, then of course the Tuckasegee, and then the one that we're all sitting in. He started this one as well. Tuckasegee was started in 1883, 2-story brick building, powered by water. Here's where the Linebergers come in. Caleb Lineberger's son had worked for Caleb up in the Woodlawn Mill for a little while, and his dad thought he should get some experience somewhere else, so he sent him down to work in Ryan's mill, Ryan's new mill, Tuckasegee, and he stayed there for about 10 years. Daniel Ryan sold his interest once again to go to Lincoln County, which opened up the doors for Abel Lineberger to learn the business and learn all aspects of the business. And then after about 10 or 12 years, Abel Lineberger left, and we know where he went. He went to Belmont because he was made president of the Chronicle Mill in 1901, which was Belmont's first textile mill. So that was the beginning of the Lineberger stove empire over in Belmont. But you'll be surprised at how many people kind of cut their teeth in Mount Holly, in the mills of Mount Holly, and then went on to be big textile executives and start mills in other places in the county. Abel, Ryan, and Walter Glenn, the sons, joined the team. Like I said, Ryan liked to work with his family. His philosophy was not to build big mills, but to have lots of small mills that he could easily, quickly change and adapt. Got another experienced man come on board. 1916, they put all new equipment in, just in time for the 1916 flood, which once again wiped everything out and left several feet of mud and silt. He did clean up once again and cleaned it, but like I said, by 1918, I think that wore him out. He was tired of trying, so he retired. Abel Ryan had retired. 1920 though, his sons kept the thing running and increased the capacity, but then by the early 20s, Southern Power was trying to buy up everything, so by 1923 they convinced them to sell the Tuckasegee Mill and 625 acres around the mill to them, and they purchased it. Then a new business was incorporated called the Tuckasegee Spinning Company. Southern Power was renamed Duke Energy or Duke Power in 24. By 25, Duke Power owned 3 textile mills and put them all under one roof and put William Suttonfield in charge of them. They created a new company called Superior Yarn Mills to manage all of the Duke Power textile companies. Like I said, they didn't care really about the textile production. They cared about that water power, but they still needed to make those mills work. Tuckasegee Spinning converted over to electricity. No surprise there. A lot of prominent people worked at the Tuckasegee. By the mid-40s, production capacity was up over 13,000 spindles. The East Mambo and Long Island mills, which were the other 2 mills, along with the Tuckasegee under Duke Power's umbrella, were up in Lincoln County. They were actually torn down to make way for Lake Norman. And then by the late 60s, the best equipment from those 2 mills were moved to the Tuckasegee. Superior Yarn Mills was sold to Clyde Fabrics. Tuckasegee often called the Superior plant because of that. It was sold to Tycaro, and then Tycaro was sold to Dixie Yarns, and Dixie Yarns closed the mill in 1992, and in 1997 tore it down. And today, if you ever go down to the marina, Tail Race Marina and Tuckasegee Park, that's where the mill used to sit. And so the name is still there. Now, we have the Gaston's first mill came along in the latter part of the 1800s, Mount Holly Knitting Company, and then Hard Manufacturing. This is the building that we're sitting in right now, built in 1888. It was the first knitting mill and the 11th textile mill in the county. It was incorporated in February, and you can see it's Ryan Dusto, Costner, his father-in-law, and a lot of other Costners. Here's a problem. They only had authorized capital of about $8,000, which was not a good sign because the financial institutions did not know how to fund knitting operations. They were familiar with spinning operations, but knitting was new, relatively new. And so they didn't want to put a whole lot of money up for a knitting operation. It was the first mill in Mount Holly not to be built on a river or big creek, although it said it was water powered by a nearby stream. So if, I've asked the question earlier, if anybody knows what stream is near to this mill that it could have been powered by, that maybe has been covered over or ended, I would love to know which one powered it. It produced cotton hosiery, but only produced it for about a year. They realized knitting was a whole different animal. Knitting was not spinning, and they didn't know how to do it very well. So they took out all the knitting equipment and put in yarn spinning equipment. 1890, less than 4 months later, a new company was formed, Albion Manufacturing Company. Albion is an old name for England. Corporators were, and this is unusual, you had both Ryan and Hutchison working together here. It's the only time you'll ever see that, and it didn't last long, but it did last for a little while. The authorized capital was $100,000. This is when Egbert Hutchison leaves the company just a year later to go start his first mill, the Nims Mill. Ryan was named president, and then 2 other textile men, Thomas Love and John Rankin, came in. Love and Rankin left. once again, got their feet wet, and then they left to go start the Spencer Mountain Mill, or to work at the Spencer Mountain Mill. Steam power was added. Ryan buys out his partners, reorganizes with just his family members. Like I said, he only liked to work with his family members. He didn't like to work with outside folks. Electricity replaces steam and water. Capacity was increased. This is where Ryan sells off all of his textile interest in his first 3 mills and retires. So Ryan is really no longer an active member of the picture after 1918. But then, 1918, Catawba Spinning Company is organized by Rankin, who had worked there before, and we see the name Robert Fulton Craig for the first time. Craig comes into play. Craig worked as a superintendent at several of Hutchison's mills later on. The assets of Albion were purchased. New operation had 4,200 spindles. 1920, a new 2-story brick addition was added to this building. New machinery was installed. The Great Depression forced it into the receivership, so it had to shut down for a short period of time. It was foreclosed, the machinery was sold, until the end of the Great Depression, the start of World War II, which that war economy brought a lot of new business into play. It was sold at Whitehall Knitting Mills, purchased the mills and installed 45 full-fashion knitting machines. That survived through the 40s thanks to the war economy. That's the only thing that kept it alive, but by the end of the 40s, it was out of business too. So knitting was just not our thing at the time. But then American Yarn and Processing purchased the mill and used it as storage for a long time, this building. American Yarn turns into American and Eford. They renovate the mill and turn it into their consumer products division. And so this was office space for A&E for several years. Then they consolidated all their offices close to their mills and vacated the mill. Now Holly purchased it in 2003. Renovations began, and then in 2008 it opened as what we see today. So that was the Mountain Holly knitting mill. Okay, then look at all these mills. Things really start picking up towards the end of the 1800s. You can see all these mills opening up. We'll cover the NIMS because that was in Mount Holly, but these were all over the county. You started seeing new mills pop up. Here's where Hutchison starts what became American and Eford. This is the first mill. This is his first mill, 1891. Named it the NIMS because his wife's brother-in-law, Luther Nims, owned the property where they built the mill. It was called Nims Shoals, so they named it the Nims Manufacturing after him. It was water-powered on Nims Shoals, 1.5 stories, 2,000 spindles, men, women, and children working, 100 employees, 4,800 spindles, and there's Robert Fulton Craig again coming into play, working as a superintendent. Steam power added, production capacity increased. The Great Flood, once again, did about $20,000 worth of damage, but they turned it back around and merged it into the American Yarn and Processing Company. The mill ceased operations in 1930 because of the Great Depression. And it was used as a warehouse. Then in 1942, R.S. Dixon and Company, an investment firm, purchased American Yarn and Processing. Hutchison died, and so Rush Dixon becomes the executive officer of the company. They take the Nims mill, open it back up, renovate it, modernize it, and then they resumed operations in 1945. American Yarn Processing gains control of Eford. They become American and Eford. Mr. Dixon dies. 1968 becomes Ruddy Corporation. Ruddy Corporation becomes the parent company. A&E consolidates its manufacturing plants and closes the Rush plant. Airborne Coatings moved in there for a while, and now it's a self-storage facility. But the mill is still there. That's what it looks like now, out on Woodlawn. And I know we're probably running really long, but I'm going to keep going. Anybody that needs to leave, it's not going to hurt my feelings because I know I'm running long. But if anybody who wants to stick around, please do. There was a period here where not a lot was done in Mount Holly, but there were mills built in other places, including the largest mill in the South, the Lower Eight Mills, was built in 1900 over in Gastonia. Then we finally get to the early 1900s and we have the Woodlawn Mill, another Hutchison mill. Was the Woodlawn, notice the family down there taking a photo. You can see the little guy and his family to show what size the mill was. Woodlawn was incorporated in 1905. This was Hutchison's second mill. He got his friend, engineer and designer Stuart Kramer, involved, and he actually designed the Woodlawn Mill. So that's where Stuart Kramer was involved in Mount Holly as well. The original mill village had 25 houses in the roads surrounding the mill, as was the custom of the day. The original mill, you can see the dimensions there. And despite being on Dutchman's Creek, it was actually built as an electrically powered mill. So it was the third mill that was built that way, electric powered only. Hutchison was elected president. They survived the panic in 1907. They survived the 1916 flood. They were a little farther off of the water. They did have to replace some things. Combing equipment was coming in, and that was important because combed cotton was far more desirable than just carded cotton. And so all of the mills in Gaston County were starting to switch over to combed cotton around this time. Hutchison was the first mill owner to create what was called a chain of mills or group of mills called the American Yarn and Processing Company. Other ones were Armstrong, Gracie Park, Rankin, lots of well-known names, the Stowe-Lineberger chain of mills, where they managed multiple mills under one management group. The company ran successfully throughout the 20s. Hutchison died in 42. This is where Dixon took over again, which turned into American Eford. The Woodlawn was sold to Kimberly Yarns. Kimberly Yarns was sold to Philcrest Mills and referred to as the Mount Holly Spinning Mill. No relation to this one at all. Philcrest was then sold to Spray Cotton Mills in 78. And Spray Cotton Mills ceased to operate in 2001. They sold it to the Johnson family, who turned it into an auction house and private retail place. Then in 2009, and 2011, and then again in 2014, it changed hands to all these management groups that planned to do something with it, but nobody ever did anything with it. 2016, Historic Preservation Foundation of North Carolina purchased the Woodlawn in order to save it. In 22, it qualified for the NC Brownfields project. This was where they took contaminated properties and turned them back into usable space. It qualified for that. And so it was put into that program. December 23, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, so it couldn't just be bulldozed down. And then it was announced this year that it's going to be turned into apartments. So the Woodlawn is going to be the 5th textile mill in Gaston County to be turned into apartments. The first being the Loray Mill, then the Trenton Mill, then the Chronicle Mill, then the Osage Mill, and now the Woodlawn Mill in Mount Holly. So it will not be torn down. And that's what it looks like right now. Not much to see, but it'll look nice when they turn it into apartments, I'm sure. Then we had boom, starting in the early 1900s. You can see all the different mills that were built, but none in Mount Holly during this time. Here, another section, 11 through 15, 1911 to 1915, none here in Mount Holly. But you probably recognize a lot of these names as you see them, of mills that are in the county. Then we get into the big boom, World War I. All the textile operations were being shut down in Europe, so America had to pick up the slack. So textile companies were being opened left and right during the 1916, 17, 18, and 19 time period. One during this time was the Adrian Manufacturing Mill, which is right here in Mount Holly. That's what it looked like from the railroad side. It was opened in 1916, and it was another Hutchison mill, and there's Lowe, that name. So it really should be the Hutchison-Lowe group of mills, although Lowe was kind of a silent partner throughout most of this. It was an average-sized mill powered by electricity. It was merged into the newly formed American Yarn and Processing Company. Then another mill that almost the same size was built right across the railroad tracks from it, called the Medora Mill. And it wasn't long after that that the Adrian and Medora Mills were essentially combined and treated as one mill. You hear it as the Adrian Medora Mill. And they built a conveyor system over the railroad. So they did half of the processing in the Adrian, then they would go over by conveyor, by a monorail system, over to the Medora, and Medora would finish it off. By 2000, there were 1,700 spindles. A&E ceased the operation in 2001. They used it as a warehouse. And then in 2014, the city of Mount Holly purchased it, and they use it for some of their utilities and their sanitation department. And that's what it looks like today. Then we had another large period of another boom. Once again, World War I was going on, so we were supplying our allies over in Europe with lots of fabric. We had 2 Mount Holly mills built during this time. This one was the American Processing Mill by Hutchison. It was the first mercerizing plant. What was happening is the cotton was having to be spun into yarn, then they were having to ship it off to the north to be mercerized or bleached or have wet processing, is what they called it. And then it was having to be shipped back down here to finish the processing and sell it. So this was a big step forward in the efficiency of that process, because now they could do all of their wet processing in the same place they were doing their dry processing, right here in Mount Holly. Greatly improved the quality and the efficiency. Dureen, I don't know if anybody recognizes that name. That was the trade name that came out, and it was the most sought after yarn in the country for many, many years, because it was produced all right here in Mount Holly. Processing plant was a 2-story brick plant. Initially processed just Hutchinson's mills yarn, but then eventually grew capacity to be able to produce other people's, other companies' yarn. Early 1920s, the plant doubled in size, merged with American Yarn Processing. Plant expanded during the World War II boom, and then the plant was named the American plant under American Neeford, and that's where it is today. This is kind of unusual, and I'm not sure what happened. I need to ask some folks over at American Neeford. But you can see they put a new brick facade on everything except for that one little section. And maybe it was to show the original mill. That's the original American Processing Mill. Look at it a little closer. You can see that's the old original mill. This is where they bricked it up to air condition it, but they left it exposed for some reason. They didn't brick it over. And I don't know if you can see that, but you can see the arch on that original window. You can see the arch, what they call ghost architecture, on there. So once again, maybe they left it open on purpose so you could see where they came from. Then we have globe yarn mills. This is the first mill, and I think the only mill in recent, or in the early years, that Ryan or Hutchison had nothing to do with. It was Craig. Robert Fulton Craig, another prominent name. It was incorporated in 1919, mill completed. However, it didn't start running until after World War I, when the boom was over and the recession was beginning, the post-war. So it actually went into receivership almost immediately in the 1930s. 33, the charter was liquidated, but then in 1933, a new company was created from a family of Nicholsons. They assumed ownership of everything. The mill survived the Great Depression because of the World War II economy. You can see they made knitting yarn mainly, but then Burlington bought it in 1962, and they ran it as their Burlington Knit Fabrics division. They modernized it throughout those years, and in 2000, their denim fabrics division employed about 100 people in that mill. But then in 2002, they closed down the mill when there was about 90 employees there. Several companies were in and out of there, and portions of the mill, and then it was dismantled over the past 2 years. And it's currently for sale beside it, so if anybody wants to buy an old mill.
We wish somebody would buy it.
Yeah, I know. That's what it looks like. There it is. Yeah, not pretty. But this is kind of a unique thing. This is a 1938 aerial view of the original mill that was built And you can see the shadow of all the additions. And they tore down just the old mill, but they left all the additions. So that's what's there now, is for some reason they tore down the original mill that sat right in the middle of all that, and all the additions are still there. So, but then, I hesitated to even put this one here, but I'll run through these quickly. This is Gaston County Dye Machine, started as Craig and Hornbuckle in 1921 over at Stanley. And it was all pretty much in Stanley until 1967, when they built their brand new 300,000 square foot facility on Charles Raper Road, which is in between, and it took on a Mount Holly address at that time. Then they, very shortly after that, they moved their whole headquarters there. So essentially Gaston County Dyeing Machine was a Mount Holly company at that time. Didn't produce yarn or anything, but they produced dyeing equipment, wet processing equipment for the textile industry. Very successful over the years, and it was officially dissolved in 2023. And there are other companies in that building now, non-textile companies that are operating out of there. Then we had another boom during the 1920-22 area, and this brings us to the last of the Hutchison mills. And then there was a whole bunch of mills that were built shortly after 1922, but not with an associated mill village, just individual mills or new companies that came along. So we ended up with about 111 textile mills by the mid-1920s. And then you'll see on another chart, we actually ended up with close to 400 textile companies in Gaston County at the height. This is the Medora Mill, very quick. It was built as a separate mill directly across from the railroad tracks from the Adrian. Looked almost like the Adrian, part of American Eford. They combined, same thing as the Adrian. They performed part of it one and part of the processing of the other. It had 17,000 spindles at one time. American Eford ceased operation and closed it. Parkdale actually leased it in 2003, and they're still operating out of the Medora Mill to this day, or they at least still have it listed on their website as one of their mills. I don't know what they're doing in there. Could be just storage. And then that's what it looks like today. Some of the other ones very quickly, they didn't last long. The Carolina Dyeing and Winding Company started actually in Massachusetts in 1927, moved here, leased a building from American Yarn and Processing Company until 1951 when it moved to Charlotte, and by 1957 it had closed its operations altogether. But that was here in Mount Holly. That's the building they leased. It's right in the middle of American Eford's finishing plant now, so it's still there, hidden among all those additions. Then Leakesville Woolen Mills. Everybody remember Leakesville Woolen Mills? They were actually started up in Eaton, North Carolina by John Motley Moorhead, the previous governor. The Moorhead Scholarship, Moorhead Planetarium. He started Leakesville Woolen Mills up in Eaton, and in 1933 they built their third mill, which happened to be in Mount Holly. And it ran from 1933 to 1986. But they also had their largest mill over in Charlotte, Rosal's Ferry Road, just across the river, at a place called the Homestead site. So if you look up the Homestead site, you'll see they had a pretty extensive campus there. 77, they employed, I don't know if this is true, but there was an article that said they employed 250 workers in Mount Holly. That seems like a lot for the size of the mill that it was. Maybe that was over three shifts or something. Chatham Manufacturing, who was the parent company, closed it down in '86. There were only 11 people working there, and now the Claremont Regional Medical Center, right across the street, or right across the highway, is sitting where Leakesville used to be. Then Holly Knit and Finishing Knit, these were subsidiaries of American Yarn and Processing. They only lasted for about 10 years, but then they were absorbed into American and Eford. And then, of course, we have American. I could do a whole presentation just on American and Eford, but we won't because we're out of time, I know. But it was taken on by Ruddick Corporation in '68, became a part of Elevate Textiles in 2019. They celebrated 135 years in 2026. And all of these powerhouses, Cone Mills, Burlington Industries, that used to be powerhouse individual companies, are all part of this Elevate Textiles now. That was just kind of the name of the game. Clariant was a chemical company, and it used to make dyes and chemicals for the textile industry. Not sure if it still does, but it's here in Mount Holly. The Belmont Textile Machinery, even though the name is Belmont, it has a Mount Holly address out on Catawba Avenue, and they were one of 125 machine shops in Gaston County during the height of the textile industry. We had more machine shops per capita than any other county in the country because they were servicing all of these textile mills. And they did something unique. They actually built and started their own company. Belmont Textile Machinery built a company and started it called Catawba Yarns in 1971. That's where they could practice and use some of their new inventions and new creations and test out things in Catawba Yarns. It lasted until 1989. North Carolina Filtration, which uses the textile materials, is based out of there today. And then finally, the last company to come to Mount Holly was Glatfelter. It was started in 1864 in Pennsylvania. The name was changed to simply Glatfelter in 2001. They relocated their headquarters to Charlotte in 2020, and they acquired the Georgia Pacific site in 2021, and they produce nonwovens. There are three types of textiles, textile fabrics: knits, wovens, and nonwovens. Nonwovens is a huge area. It's, other people call it engineered fabrics. You'll find them in everything. So look up nonwovens if you're curious about that. But that's Glatfelter. That's a brand new company that started here. This is what happened after World War II. You can see the trends just the opposite of what it was prior to World War II. With trade agreements, with lots of different things happening. New companies just started dwindling. They're still around. American Eford still operates out of 8 of the original textile plants in Gastonia, and then they have their huge campus here in Mount Holly, so you can see what happened there. So, I apologize for the length and all the information. Anybody who would like a copy of the PowerPoint, I'll be happy to send that to you so you can go back through it, since I had to rush through some of that. But thank you so much for allowing me to be here, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer for you, if I can.
What was the last?
Yes,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
What was the last mill built?
The last mill in Mount Holly or in Gaston County?
Oh, in Mount Holly.
In Mount Holly, the last one would have been the Medora. Medora was the last one built that had an associated mill village with it. There were other manufacturing facilities.
Which one didn't have a mill village? The first one that had a mill village.
That would be where another company moved into one of the old mills that already had a mill village, so they really didn't have to
The
build.
Globe didn't have a village.
What's that?
Did the Globe have a village?
It did. It had 12 houses. They only built 12 houses, and those houses were sold to the employees, I think, within the first 20 years that the place was in existence. It was never really successful until Burlington got in there, but by that time, companies were out of the housing business, so they didn't even worry about whether there was a mill village or not.
Yeah, I was going to ask if convict labor was used in any of the mills.
Not typically in the mills, but outside the mills. In other words, for maintenance and for security, believe it or not. They convicts for security sometimes. They also used it for hauling and moving. Same thing that the enslaved Africans prior to the Civil War were used for. They were employed, if you want to call it that, at companies, but they were never allowed in the mill usually. They only had duties outside the mill, at least from the records that I've seen. But interesting story, McCadden Mills, the first dynamo they put in to run their electric light system in 1881, it actually caught fire in 1883, and the fire was about to catch the mill on fire and burn it down completely, which would have changed the whole story of McCadden Mill. But there was a chain gang, a crew of convicts working on the outside of the mill, and they put the fire out and saved McCadden Mill. So you thank convicts for that. In fact, we have Christmas lights. Any other questions? Yes.
What exactly was happening to the mills in Europe during World War II? Were they closing, being converted?
If they were outside of the bombing areas, they probably were trying to operate on limited time. However, that was when any kind of manufacturing plant was a target for the Germans. And if they saw anything running, operating, because Texas were a key part to the war, not just uniforms, but tents, tarps, tire fabric. That's what the Lorry Mill, Firestone Mill did. They made tire fabric that went into the Jeep tires and things like that. All of your fan belts and hoses are all supported by textile products in there. But Europe probably had some that were on the outskirts that may have kept running, but it was like putting a target on your back to run a mill or run any kind of manufacturing facility. And I guess they could run if they blacked it out so it couldn't be seen, but there were spies. There were spies infiltrating, both sides, and so they would find it out. So America picked up and we shipped lots of materials from America over to Europe in both World War I and World War II. Any other questions? I appreciate your patience, and I know that you probably need to stand up and stretch. So please do that. I know there's some refreshments back there. Any other questions though? And feel free to come and ask me and grab one of my cards. If you want to send me an email, I'll be happy to send you the PowerPoint to you. And if there's anything that we can ever do for you at the museum, please come and visit us as well as the Mount Holly Museum here. And we're glad to help you any way we can. So thank you for letting me be here tonight. Appreciate it.